Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Filipe Nobre Faria. He currently works as a researcher in ethics and political philosophy at the Institute for Philosophy of the Nova University of Lisbon. And today we're going to focus on his book, The Evolutionary Limits of Liberalism, Democratic Problems, Market Solutions, and the Ethics of Preference Satisfaction. So, Dr. Nobre Faria, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to be here again, and hopefully this will be fruitful.
Yeah, sure. By the way, I really loved the book. I've been waiting to interview you for the last 3 years or so since the book came out. But yeah, it is what it is. But thank you for writing it anyway.
I know you have a long list of the people to interview, so I understand it, and they're all good. So there's a good reason for that.
Well, thank you. So tell us first then, what would you say is basically the premise of the book? What are you trying to explore here?
Right. So the the basic premise of the book is or the main question of the book is liberalism sustainable? And by liberalism here we mean the liberal paradigm, right? Our models. It's the liberal paradigm in political and social terms. Of course, I focus more on the political side of it, but everything is included. So the question really is, can liberalism last? Is this a sustainable model? Can we actually maintain this system for the foreseeable future? And so my answer is essentially no, that liberalism um, does not have, from an evolutionary perspective, liberalism has many problems or many maladaptive tendencies that make it maladaptive in the long run. So I don't present normative solutions to this problem. My intention was to identify certain problems with liberalism in order for us to think about it. And so the main problem with liberalism is that it is not conducive to reproductive fitness. So it tends to have um, a detrimental effect on reproductive rates. And it is also not conducive to social cohesion. It has um, um, problematic effects on the cohesion of societies. And groups cannot cohere around the values of liberalism, which are more atomizing. So the critique that liberalism is atomizing is not necessarily new, but what I try to do in this book is to explain from an evolutionary scientific perspective why liberalism is problematic and will probably not last in the long run.
Okay, but just to be clear, how do you define liberalism, or at least what would you say are the main tenets of liberalism you focus on, and do you think and that you think have the most impact from an evolutionary perspective?
Right, right. So, of course, to define liberalism is always a contentious activity. But I guess that there is some. So there's liberalism is there are some tenets of liberalism that I think are consensual. So the main one is that it focuses on individuals. Um, every time there is a tension between what is good for the individual and what is good for the group or what is good for the community, liberalism tends to favor the individual. It focuses on the individual. The individual is its moral unit. so to speak. So that is extremely important. That's why it is seen as an individualistic philosophy. Um, then, of course, there's the question of state neutrality, which is the idea that the state or the community cannot impose a way of life on individuals, that individuals should be free to pursue their own way of life. And therefore, if the state or the community engages in the promotion or the enforcement of a particular way of life, that is illegitimate according to liberalism. So I think that these tenets are somehow consensual. So of course, then we have all the more technical aspects, like in liberal systems we have separation of powers. The idea is to contain power so that nobody has too much power, precisely to prevent the imposition of a particular way of life. Um, and so you ultimately, in a nutshell, liberalism is, I would say, is about the maximization of individual liberty and equality. It is a universal philosophy, so it does not distinguish between individuals at the formal level. Yeah, and it tries to apply that in politics and in social morality.
Mhm. Do you also try to understand where the ideology of liberalism comes from? I mean, I'm not sure if it has some sort of biological basis to it or if it's just cultural, but where does it come from?
Well, that's a good question. Where does it come from? Well, historically, it came together with the Enlightenment, right? So this is where we begin to talk about liberalism, where it takes form, where the specific the canonical liberal writers appear, like John Locke, Kant, etc. So it definitely starts at that particular point. So liberalism is somehow the winning. It's the winner of modernity. So modernity is not necessarily the same as liberalism, but liberalism is definitely the political philosophy that won, that prevailed, and that is certainly attached to the Enlightenment. So one could say that liberalism is the moral dimension of the Enlightenment, even though those are separate entities. We can have an illiberal Enlightenment, and we can have a liberal Enlightenment. But definitely, liberalism came attached with the Enlightenment. Uh, so, does it have any biological basis? Well, um, I guess it does, because everything has a biological basis. Um, so we know that liberalism is very much attached to Protestant personality, so people that adhere to Protestantism, again, like Locke, Kant, etc. So we know that it was a way to contain religious wars, um, and it probably served the interests of some groups. So in this case, it could be the bourgeoisie, it could be the religiosity of Protestantism. So there are definitely interests or tendencies behind the birth of liberalism, but it can go deeper. I mean, if liberalism is an offshoot of Christianity, then perhaps liberalism started way back 2,000 years ago, and it developed from that point onwards.
Yeah. What would you say, politically speaking, are some of the main opposing ideologies, the ones that oppose liberalism? For example, in the book, you talk about communitarianism. Could you tell us about it and perhaps some other ideologies that you think are opposed to liberalism?
Mhm. Yeah. So usually, so communitarianism is not really an ideology. Communitarianism came about as a criticism of liberalism.
Mm.
So communitarian authors, and here I'm thinking about authors that sometimes don't even call themselves communitarian, but Michael Sandel, Michael Walzer, and others.
Mhm.
So there was this criticism of liberalism, that essentially the main criticism was that liberalism didn't take into account the importance of the community,
Mhm.
and because of that, liberalism was atomizing. It made people unhappy in many different ways. So the critique of liberalism, the communitarian critique of liberalism, is complex, but it ultimately boils down to the idea that we are. It goes back to Aristotle. Essentially, we are social creatures. We are social animals. We cannot understand ourselves as individuals before the community. So the community comes first. Only then we are already born into communities. We are products of communities. We cannot see ourselves primarily as individuals. And if we see ourselves primarily as individuals, that has that brings many problems. Atomization is probably the main one, but it brings many problems that then we cannot address precisely because we are going against our social nature, or we are running against it, so to speak. So yes, but then again, but the communitarianism is this critique. But communitarianism, we can find it in many political philosophies or ideologies. We can find it in conservatism. Conservatism is communitarian. We can find it in fascism. We can find it in types of socialism. We can find it in several ideologies that focus on the community, that are ready to sacrifice certain individual liberties for the good of the community. So they go back to a more classical political philosophy that we find in ancient Greece, which was inherently communitarian.
Mhm. So, satisfying individual preferences is a big topic here, I think. And in the book, you go through two of the main contenders we have now, free markets and liberal democracies. But before we get into what distinguishes them, do you think it's also important in the context of your book to understand or try to understand where individual preferences come from, how they develop?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the book, the question of individual preferences is important because I think that one of the defining features of liberalism is that people should be free to satisfy their preferences.
Mhm.
Um, there are, of course, variations within this sphere, but I think that most liberals would feel comfortable with this idea that liberalism, um, as long so to the extent that it is possible, liberalism should facilitate what I call the liberal satisfaction of preferences. People should be free to satisfy their preferences. Um, and and what I do in this book is I analyze the evolutionary impact that um, this moral this goal of trying trying to make people satisfy their preferences freely. I try to understand what this goal actually does in evolutionary terms.
Mhm.
So, and that is why it is important to talk about individual preferences and this ethic of allowing people to satisfy their preferences freely. Um, but going back to your question, so you asked where do I think preferences come from, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, preferences come from two big dimensions. One is a biological one, so we have propensions to have certain preferences. And
Yeah.
another one is cultural. It comes from the social norms that we have, the incentives that we have, socially speaking, and these two combined will shape our preferences.
Mm.
So in a way, I'm appealing to gene culture coevolution, that preferences will come from the combination of these two elements. And what I found important in this book is that there have been critics of liberalism and of liberal democracy in general,
Mhm.
um, that focus on the problems of liberal democracy and how liberal democracy cannot satisfy people's preferences because of many reasons. We'll probably talk about these reasons afterwards. These are essentially problems of collective action, that we cannot solve collective action problems within liberal democracy, and so we cannot satisfy our preferences. Um, and ultimately, um, there are attempts to solve this issue by trying to create other systems, like for instance free markets, um, systems that allow us to satisfy our preferences better. And what I'm saying is that from an evolutionary perspective, uh, to let people free, to let them be free to satisfy their preferences in any way they want to, is actually maladaptive. So to allow people to choose freely without framing their preferences is actually maladaptive, and because liberalism, regardless of the method we were talking about, whether it is more whether we want to focus on liberal democracy or we want to focus on markets, regardless of the mechanism, uh, what seems to be problematic is the liberal satisfaction of preferences, is this ethic that is tightly connected to liberalism that will then lead to maladaptive behaviors. But we'll talk about that later on.
Yes, sure. So, in what ways would you say free markets differ from liberal democracies when it comes to their capacity of satisfying individual preferences? What would you say are some of the limitations that perhaps liberal democracies have, and possibly also free markets?
Right. So um, within public choice theory, and public choice theory is a way of studying politics from a rational choice perspective, using economic tools and applying these economic tools to the study of behavior in politics. So what's if we talk to several political economists, and here for instance I'm thinking about Jason Brannon, that who wrote Against Democracy, the book Against Democracy, where essentially he lists all the problems of liberal democracies that we find from a rational choice perspective. So for instance, the principal agent problem. The principal agent problem is a problem of representation. There are principals, in this case, the voters or the citizens, and then there are agents, the politicians. And the problem here is that the agents, the politicians, have way more knowledge, way more power than the principals, than the voters.
Mhm.
And so the voters, the policies that are enacted are much more a result of the politicians' preferences than the results of the voters' preferences. Then we have for instance, rational ignorance. Because we live in these mass democracies, it is actually rational to be ignorant about politics. It doesn't pay off to invest in knowledge about politics, because our vote will basically not decide any major election. We can vote left, right, center, whatever. It will not make a difference. In the end, those results that we see on the television after the elections, those percentages, they will not be affected by our vote. So we can stay at home, or if we like to vote, we can go there and vote. That's fine. It will not change the outcome, and those percentages will not change because we go or we stay at home, right? So to be very informed about politics from this instrumental perspective is completely useless. It's pointless to be informed about politics, because we will not influence anything. So then there's even rational rationality, which is something even worse than rational ignorance. Rational rationality is the idea that we are not only ignorant, but we think that we know things. So we are not just ignorant about politics, but we feel strong. We have strong feelings about it, and we think that we actually know. And so we go and we vote, and we, even though we are terribly wrong and we are terribly ignorant about politics, we are completely motivated to go there. So there's this irrationality behind the process that will make us choose bad policies over and over again. And then, of course, there's rent seeking. Rent seeking is this idea that there are always actors in politics that are well placed. They are usually small and well organized, and they are very well informed about policies because it concerns them directly, and they will invest in getting what they want. These small interest groups, they can solve their collective action problems much better than the masses. The masses are too atomized for that, and so these small interest groups will eventually get the policies that they want, and so they will concentrate the benefits on themselves, and they will spread the costs on the citizens, on everyone else, and the citizens cannot do much to stop this process. So liberal democracies are problematic in so many ways from this point of view, that it is widely acknowledged that the voters cannot really satisfy their preferences very well, because there are all these problems attached to democracies. And so people like James Buchanan and others, they are liberals, and they try to solve this problem by saying we should make less choices via liberal democracy. We should make more choices via markets. We should, because when we're buying and selling things, we are essentially we are close to our decisions, we are close to the products, and we are responsible for what we buy and for what we spend. So there's the rationality behind the market process is higher, according to this logic, is higher than in liberal democracies. In liberal democracies, we see irrationality in many dimensions, but above all, people don't really satisfy their preferences, especially their well-informed preferences, which is what I guess we would like to.
Right. But where do free markets fail exactly? Because I mean, I would imagine that free markets are also not perfect when it comes to satisfying people's individual preferences, or are they?
Right. So of course, in economics, there's something called market failure, but I don't think that you're referring to that exactly. I think you're more referring to where markets fail when it comes to satisfying people's preferences. Even though market failures in economics, market failures are also connected to that, perhaps, but perhaps it's not so evident. So I guess that where markets fail to satisfy people's preferences, well, it starts with a very basic point, which is if you don't have money to buy whatever you want, you cannot buy it.
Right.
So, but and of course, these classical liberals, they acknowledge that, but they say, look, but before you criticize markets for that, take a look at the alternative that you're suggesting, which is liberal democracy. Is it better? And they say, no, it is not. Because look, yes, it's true that in the marketplace, we only have a certain amount of money and we can only buy a certain amount of things. But your euros, they still count. €1 is €1 for every single person. While the vote, individually speaking, really cannot decide anything. And if it cannot decide anything, then €1 in the market is still more powerful than one vote in liberal democracies. So what they're saying is that we should be fair when we are comparing things. We should, before we criticize markets, we should look at the other side. Like I think it was Gordon Tullock that said something like, waits until every single singer sings, until all of them sing. Don't just criticize the first one because he got out of tune, to check if the other ones sing better. And this is the same. This is what they're saying about markets and liberal democracy when it comes to making choices. They say, yeah, markets have problems. They will not satisfy the preferences of people entirely, but they are still more efficient than liberal democracies. Liberal democracies really cannot satisfy anyone's preferences, at least from an individual perspective.
And can free markets be democratic?
Yes, I guess that these authors, these classical liberal authors that advocate for this, for giving more decision making to the market, they actually think that there is a type of democracy in the market. Yes, that we can all buy and sell things, whatever we want, and the choices that we make are real choices. They have real consequences. And that is actually better than the one vote that we have in liberal democracy, because that one vote doesn't have any consequence. So they actually claim that markets have a stronger democratic element than liberal democracy per se.
Right. But I mean, here, when we distinguish between free markets and liberal democracies when it comes to their capacity of fulfilling people's individual preferences or satisfying them, I mean, you're not saying necessarily that they are, I mean, in societies, in countries across the globe, that they are mutually exclusive, right? Because there are many societies, I wouldn't say perhaps most, but many societies out there where people live, politically speaking, in liberal democracies. And of course, that idea of having a completely free market, it's perhaps a myth, because the markets are always regulated to some extent, but we have a bit of both still, right?
Right, and just like every single discussion, I guess that this is a matter of having more of something and or less of something. It is not about absolutes, right? So even people that defend free markets, or at least these people in particular, James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock and these public choicers, these classical liberals, Of course, what they say is that yes, we should have a social contract, we should have a type, some sort of democracy at the political level, but we have so many different preferences, and we are so many that we are much better off leaving most of our decisions to the market, and only what the market cannot solve adequately we should leave to politics. So yes, you are right. This is a matter of degree. So we are, of course, using ideal types here, pushing more in one direction or in the other direction. But I guess it's most people would say that yes, well, and liberal democracies also have markets or free markets or largely free markets. So sometimes people actually find it strange because they think that liberal democracies are systems that already include markets. So why are we choosing one over the other? And yes, it's true. It's true that they come as a combo. It's just a matter of understanding if we want to leave more decisions for politics or more decisions for the market.
Right. So before we talk a little bit more about some of the evolutionary shortcomings of liberalism and comparing it to perhaps other alternative ideologies, why is it that you, in the book, you choose the working within a framework of multi-level selection? Why multi-level selection and not just, let's say, adopting a so-called gene's eye view of evolution or tackling things just from an individual selection perspective, for example?
Right. That's a good question. So when we decide to approach this problem from an evolutionary perspective, we must follow the standard models in evolutionary theory.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't think that there is a tension at all between multi-level selection and the gene-eyed view or inclusive fitness. I do think that they are different perspectives of the same phenomenon. Um, and, and this is not even that contentious, and even though there are some people that still fight uh, in terms of group selection versus inclusive fitness, or I don't think that is a very interesting debate anymore. And at least according to some evidence and to some polls, most evolutionary thinkers these days see these models in terms of equivalence, that there is an equivalence between all these models. And so the model that you choose, at least from my perspective, the model that I choose is, I think, the model that can use the simplest language, and it is the model that I think can enlighten people better, that covers all the necessary elements for us to understand the phenomenon that we're studying. And that is the reason why I chose multi-level selection. So I can explain what multi-level selection is.
Sure.
Multi-level selection theory is a form of group selection. So it's the idea that natural selection operates at several levels. So, for instance, the gene, the individual, groups of individuals, etc., etc. And that a multi-level selection tries to understand the forces between individuals and groups, and tries to understand when is the case that individuals beat groups, and when groups beat individuals. So, and the logic here is that groups that are cooperative, cohesive, altruistic internally will beat groups that have more individualistic elements, more self-interested elements, egoistic elements that cannot cooperate so well. So this is the main tenet. And of course, then we can integrate inclusive fitness into it also. I didn't do it in my thesis, but it actually William Hamilton, he
Mm-hmm.
actually thought at a certain point of his life that inclusive fitness was a type of group selection. So it is included in um, in um, multi-level selection. And so this is the reason why I chose multi-level selection. I think that it is the most comprehensive model, or it's the easiest one to articulate.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, how do you understand morality from an evolutionary perspective? Because this is something we haven't touched on directly yet, but I think it's also important in the context of understanding where preferences come from, right?
Right. So you're asking how I understand morality, right, from an
Mm-hmm.
evolutionary perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so the standard under so I'm not coming up with anything new at this level. I'm taking morality as most evolutionary anthropologists take morality. So morality as a social technology that we came up with to enhance our adaptiveness, to
Mm-hmm.
make us more adaptive. Um, so of course, some people say this implies that morality is about cooperation, and I do agree. I largely agree that morality is about cooperation, even though people like Alan Buchanan tend to criticize the idea that morality is about cooperation because he would like morality to be something more universal that goes beyond cooperation. I think that I don't have a specific theory about that, but in this case, I'm going for the conservative view, which is that what we know is that it is about cooperation. If it is more than cooperation, then that has to be proven, right? I don't think that was shown at all. So morality is really a way for us to cooperate with one another to enhance our fitness, our reproductive fitness, to enhance our adaptiveness. Um, so here in this case, groups and morality is important as a cultural phenomenon. It is important because it allows us to change our collective behavior when the context changes. So imagine that we were only biological creatures that would react instinctively and almost in a machine-like way. So
Mm-hmm.
we would be almost machines prepared to react to stimuli, right? Um, that we could adapt to a certain context by doing that, but then when the context would change, we would have many problems adapting to a new context. So morality comes as a way for us to change our collective behavior without having to discard our biology, our genetic makeup. So we can simply adapt to a new context without simply having to go through a heavy process of natural selection to adapt to another context, because that is very costly in terms of fitness. Morality is very useful as a social technology precisely because it allows us to adapt to new contexts.
Mhm. And does morality also shape preferences? Since we talked about preferences earlier, and I mean, since if I understand it correctly, here we're also talking about um, cultural group selection, because I would imagine that toward the end we'll come back to this topic. But groups who adopt liberalism as the hegemonic ideology, let's say, would comparatively speaking, fail evolutionarily in comparison to groups who might adopt other ideologies that are more adaptive. But does morality also play a role in intergroup competition?
Well, yes, the short answer is yes, of course. Morality is the normative dimension of culture, right? So we're talking about cultural evolution here. You're right. So groups with that have normative standards that are more adaptive will have advantages when competing against other groups. So this is cultural selection, cultural group selection,
Mm-hmm.
as we understand it. Which, by the way, I don't think that there's a strict separation between cultural group selection and biological group selection, as some
Mm-hmm.
people actually like to do. I think it's very difficult to separate one from the other. We have to take both into consideration.
Yeah,
So in
but
this,
it's still a complicated debate, at least among, uh, for example, evolutionary biologists who study levels of selection. Because in fact there are people out there, like, just to give an example, Robert Rivers, who, if you ask him, he tends to agree that cultural group selection is a thing, but not so much biological group selection, for example.
Mhm, mhm. Yes, I know and I think it's Joe Hendricks that also adopts that position. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. To be honest, if I see it from a moral perspective, I think that there that these positions, I see them more as ways to prevent the discomfort that comes from biological group selection. Because there are many ways of understanding biological group selection. It doesn't have to be war or conflict or genocide. It can simply be differential birth rates.
Right.
Um, uh, so uh, I do think that many people like to do that distinction because it provides some comfort that it's just culture being selected. But of course, we know that culture or morality is a social technology to promote adaptiveness, right? So it has to do. There must be something there that is connected to genetic enhancement, genetic propagation.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Sure.
and I and the very own logic of gene culture coevolution uh, um, points towards the integration of cultural group selection and cultural and biological group selection. So that is, I think, my view, my 5 cents as a political and moral theorist is that I think that some of these positions are ways of avoiding some uncomfortable uh, positions. But
Right.
but 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 there may be more to it. So I don't want to. This is just the way I think that morality has a strong impact on how we theorize and how far we want to go with our theorization.
Mm-hmm. So, in the book, still within the domain of morality, you talk about things like moral types and moral foundations theory. So, we can get also into moral foundations theory, even though I've already covered it several times in the on the channel. But what are moral types?
Right. Moral types. I took the idea of moral types from Nietzsche. Nietzsche, as you probably know, thought that our standards of morality are really a reflection of who we are, of our biology, of our physiology,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you are weak, you're more likely to adhere to egalitarianism, slave morality. and so forth. You're more likely to scream for liberty and equality. If you are the strong type, you are more likely to adhere to hierarchy, domination, the imposition of strength. So this of course is, and Nietzsche talks about types. That there are types of people. So when Kant is writing, he's expressing his type. In this case, when Nietzsche is writing, Nietzsche is expressing his type. So the philosophies of people actually express the types, and I thought this was an interesting way of understanding the question of evolution, and the question of having different types of people operating in democracies and in markets. So in democracies, you may have different types of people. You may have people that are very altruistic. They have been selected for that, so they are very much publicly oriented. They want the best for the people. And then you may have the self-interested egoists that want essentially to get their way in with politics and to get the best for himself or herself. Then you will have all sorts of personalities working within politics. And the standard view within the public choice literature is that we should consider that everyone that operates within politics is a self-interested individual, right? That we should not think that that the people go to politics because they are interested in the public good, but because they are essentially trying to get their own way, get their benefits. And some people that defend this position, like James Buchanan, they actually think that that this is not exactly true. That not everyone is a self-interested egoist, but that politics has a certain dynamic that will attract those people, and ultimately, because we want to prevent those people, those egoists, from having power, we should restrict government and have a liberal system, right? So that's their view. And so even if people are not exactly like that, we should assume that they are like that. And this is an old idea. We can find it in David Hume and others. But I think that it is important that we don't deviate from reality, and that there are different types in politics, and that there may be common good types, people that go to politics truly motivated by the common good, and that are willing to self-sacrifice for the common good, right? In my classes, I often give the examples of the kamikaze in Japan, right? People that are willing to self-sacrifice for the good of the group, for the good of their nation, etc., etc. So I think that these liberal authors are putting liberalism ahead of reality because they want to give priority to liberalism rather than to reality, which is a reason why they often say, yes, people are not exactly like that, like egoistic, but we should assume that they are. So we have to restrict government, have a liberal system, etc. I do think that there are many problems with that. Those problems will then be reflected in the evolutionary perspective that I'm talking about. Essentially, I will say that people that promote a way of life and that are altruistic and interested in the common good, these people are important from an evolutionary perspective to create cohesion, to create social cohesion in groups. And liberalism actually actively prevents that, deliberately.
Yeah. So, do you care about, or do you in your book care about the distinction made between liberals and conservatives? I mean, do they also correspond in any way to moral types? And do you think that, politically speaking, that distinction plays any role at all in what you're exploring here?
Hmm. I guess it depends on what we're talking about. Liberals and conservatives. Uh, I think there is something to it, but we have to clarify what we're talking about. So, for instance, was Margaret Thatcher a liberal or a conservative? So she brought the paradigm. She not only she, but she brought the paradigm of neoliberalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the name says it all. Was she conservative? Was she a liberal? Um, so when we talk about Ronald Reagan, was he a conservative? But he also was one of those that brought neoliberalism or classical liberalism, as some might say. When we hear people like Boris Johnson, conservative people like Boris Johnson or Angela Merkel, are we are we dealing with conservatives or are we dealing with people that essentially operate on the right side of liberalism, so to speak?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, in that case, I don't think that there is a significant distinction between them. I think that they are operating within the same paradigm and they do not really reject the main tenets of liberalism, right? Individual liberty, etc., equality. But if we take conservatism to be a radical critique of liberalism, as we find in people like de Maistre, the French political theorist, in some ways also in Burke or in Carl Schmitt. If we take these people to be conservatives, I think then there's something to it, and then these types uh, make sense. It makes sense to talk about liberals and conservatives. But of course, conservatism is a reaction to liberalism. Perhaps we should just talk about liberalism or universalism or individualism versus communitarianism, because this goes way back to classical history, right? To call it conservatism is a way of saying these people are communitarians and um, that are reacting against the triumph of liberalism. They are communitarians of a hierarchical sort. If we want to call them conservatives, fine.
Yeah. So, I mean, going all the way back to the main issue explored in the book, or the main issue that you tackle there, uh, could could you be perhaps more concrete in explaining what is there really about liberalism when it comes to its values and perhaps the impact they have on people's behavior that make it run counter to maximizing fitness and potentially running into an evolutionary limit?
Right, right. Uh, Great. So that's we're getting to the central point of the book.
Mhm.
Um, so an important, decisive element of reproductive fitness is, of course, reproduction itself, right? So and we see that in liberal countries, um, we have a very low birth rates already for a long, long time,
Mhm.
and we are living in some of the perhaps we have never been so wealthy as we are now, which means that we are quite bad at converting wealth into reproductive fitness. Um, So this should make people think about the reasons why that is. Well, there may be something. that is not necessarily liberal to it, which is modernization, technology, certain ways of life that are brought to us by technology. But a huge part of it is about liberalism. So uh, one specific example is, for instance, the introduction of women into the marketplace. So there's a huge correlation between introducing women in the marketplace, and especially to education, and the drastic fall of birth rates.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, I think, not controversial. We know that this is a main cause of what is happening. And now, of course, one could say, all right, so how can we solve this problem? Can we solve this problem using liberalism? Can we solve this problem um, by saying that people should be free to pursue any way of life they want to? And it seems that it will be very difficult to do so, because if um, if in the West uh, we continue to promote the idea that every way of life is good, then there is no legitimacy to say that a way of life that maximizes fitness is the good life.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, um, there's no legitimate way of saying that. So
Right.
liberalism. Let's imagine that liberalism didn't cause the problem, right? I think that it does to a certain degree, but let's imagine that it didn't. It is still not prepared to solve the problem, because the moment we uh, we try to solve the problem, we know that we are most likely leaving the liberal paradigm. We will be talking about ways of life, proper ways of life. We will be talking about uh, who does what in terms of reproductive roles, um, and I think that the reason why this problem is not so talked about, and politicians try to solve it with by saying, oh well, no problem, we just need more immigration or something like that. Um, they avoid talking about the problem, because I think that deep down they understand that the problem cannot be solved within the liberal paradigm. But the problem is there, right? And so now the question is, will it continue to be like that? And it's fine that it's maladaptive, and then it will change somehow spontaneously through, I don't know, cultural selection, demographic selection, uh, or do people in the West want to do something about it? And that
Mm-hmm.
is, I think, one of the biggest challenges of our time. But I don't want to speak too much. Please, Ricardo, step in.
No, yeah, of course. I want to ask you perhaps two or three follow-up questions to that. So, do you think that, because I mean, many times in the political arena, particularly, people frame this as sort of a dispute between the West and the so-called rest. I mean, they associate liberal democracies with the West, and anything that is non-liberal or anti-liberal as the rest of the world. So, but do you think that framing things that way makes sense? Do you think that this is really a case of Western values versus non-Western values?
Uh, yes, well, it's true that politicians use they made liberalism synonymous with the West.
Right.
So while in the past we would talk about European civilization, now we talk about Western civilization,
Mm-hmm.
right? It seems that there's something that um, there was some change there. That it seems that European civilization refers to the classical virtues, the classical values that we'll find in Aristotle and Plato and in ancient Greece and in the Roman sphere.
Yep.
And it seems that the West is when we discover liberalism, right? Suddenly, we are the West, and we are liberal, and that is our civilization. And it seems that there is a rejection of our European civilization, which was fundamentally communitarian. Uh, and then we become individualistic. And politicians, at least judging by their rhetoric, they are still very much in love with liberalism. And I think that the reason why we cannot see the problem, we could say, we cannot see the truck heading towards us. The reason why we cannot see the problem is that we are still in love with liberalism. The strength of liberalism comes from the fact that we are still not entirely disappointed with it. Um, my guess is that problems will accumulate because something that is maladaptive will bring many problems, and we will eventually be disappointed. Uh, some people say there are already many signs of this, that there are already protests again, and many people talking about post-liberalism, and that the liberalism fail, and there are several books. Patrick Deneen, for instance, wrote the book "Why Liberalism Fails." I can't, not sure. It's something like that. And I think it's more and more people talk about post-liberalism and how to live in a world where liberalism is gone. It was a phase of European civilization. We call it Western civilization, but it doesn't have. At least I would argue in this book that it doesn't have a good, a solid evolutionary basis, which means it will give way to something else. And in a way, it is interesting because it forces to think about post-liberalism. What could come after liberalism that is more adaptive and sustainable? And I guess that this is part of cultural evolution, that we understand the problems of our moral framework, and we try to adjust and come up with something new.
Mhm. So, of course, the tension here is between liberalism and communitarianism. But do you think that it would make sense to focus more on uh, one particular aspect of the ideology of liberalism and pit it against its opposite, that is individualism versus collectivism? Do you think it would make sense to reframe or refocus the tension in that way, or is that too limited?
All right, individualism. Um,
I'm asking you that also, just to be clear, I'm asking you that also because many times, particularly when psychologists, more specifically cultural psychologists, um, look across different cultures and, for example, they compare the West with Eastern Asian countries. Many times they talk about individualist versus collectivist societies. And I was wondering
understand.
if that would be perhaps one of the main focuses of the tension here.
Hmm. Yes, I know. I know about those studies. I'm not entirely satisfied with them, and I will explain why.
Okay.
So, for instance, in those studies we will get something like um, Nordic countries are highly individualistic, while, for instance, Spain and Portugal are more collectivist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, and I do I do have some. some issues with that from an evolutionary perspective. I think that if we think about it from a multi-level selection point of view, um, I'm not entirely sure that what we see in, for instance, in Scandinavian countries, that what we see there is truly individualism. Um, it seems to me that they are more willing to provide for the common good, the common good not being just the immediate family, but the ethnic group or their nation or even Europe if they're more Europeanists. While, for instance, in Portugal or Spain, people are more likely to have a more restricted circle of altruism. Say, I favor my family and friends, my co-workers, and then I don't really care much about the rest. And this will be interpreted as a more collectivist society.
Right.
I don't think that from a multi-level perspective that this is entirely right. It seems that uh, what we see perhaps in Nordic countries is that they are enlarging the notion of their group. So rather than focusing on the close family, they are focusing on their ethnic group, for instance. And they are being altruistic towards it. And then people go there and they say, oh, they are much more individualistic because they're not favoring their kids or their cousins or whatever. I think it's the wrong way of understanding this. I don't think that they are being individualistic. They are just enlarging the unit of selection, so to speak. And that may be actually positive from a group selection perspective because they are strengthening their group at a larger level.
Right. So, and I mean, by writing this book, are you also trying to make some sort of predictions? Because, I mean, do you think that if liberal societies and non liberal ones um follow these, keep on this track, let's say, do you think that then just by virtue of cultural group selection operating by itself without anyone necessarily enforcing anything or conquering other societies or something like that, that liberal or the values of liberalism will just disappear in the future?
Um, well, if we follow logic, if liberal values are truly maladaptive, they will tend to disappear, right? From a cultural selection point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So that is self-evident. So if we follow this logic, we can say that liberalism, being maladaptive, if it is maladaptive, it will disappear. Uh, Now, I guess what you're alluding to is something that already touches upon the normative element of what to do. So here we could have two approaches. So we could say, well, let cultural evolution take its course. Liberalism will disappear. When people realize that it doesn't work, it will be too late. Those that embrace liberalism are already extinct, like it happened with so many peoples in history. Um, or from a normative perspective, to understand that this is problematic now gives the West or Europe or peoples from Europe gives them a way to rethink their path without having to go necessarily extinct. Again, if we follow the logic. Um, but that is, of course, already the normative dimension that the book opens up. It is not really part of the book. The book is a diagnosis of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, it's always difficult to predict the future, obviously, but that's why we have models, right? So we have models to predict the weather. We have models to make airplanes fly. We have models that will tell us that tomorrow the sun will rise again. Maybe we would need a model for that, right? Just some experience. And I guess that this is essentially the same process applied to politics. If we follow logic, it's not that. Of course, I'm not saying that. David Hume, for instance, famously said that it is a prejudice to think that that to think that the sun will rise tomorrow. We have no evidence that the sun will rise tomorrow, right? But we have very good models that tell us that the sun will rise tomorrow. Questions of logic, etc. And this is the same process. I cannot 100%. I cannot be 100% sure that this is true. But if we analyze the models carefully, I think we can be pretty sure that liberalism does not have a future.
Well, okay, so one last question then, and this one doesn't have necessarily anything directly to do with the book, but anyway, of course, and since we also talked a little bit about morality here, whenever one tries to tackle morality from a scientific, in this case, evolutionary perspective, this question uh, gets to the table, I guess. So, what do you think about the so-called is ought distinction? Because, of course, it's two different things. One of them, in this case, is to just simply, for example, describe how our morality works, where liberal versus non-liberal values come from, etc. And that's one thing. The other thing is for us to decide if liberal values or non-liberal values are better, which set of them is the superior one. So there's still that distinction. But do you think that in any way is can imply ought or not at all?
Good question. That opens up a discussion in metaethics, which is, of course, very relevant for this. This book in particular is not about metaethics, but I already have a paper. The paper is called "Social Evolution as Moral Truth Tracking in Natural Law," where I talk about how we should understand the transition from is to ought. Um, so yes, implied in this book is the idea that if something is maladaptive, it has some moral strength. Now, of course, this is a meta-ethical position. I do think that common sense would support this position, but I'm not trying to support it with common sense. So obviously, as a philosopher, I should support it with philosophical arguments. Even though common sense can be a philosophical argument to to a degree. So I guess it's from my experience, most people that come across my book and my message, they tend to think that they tend to accept that yes, if something is not sustainable, something is maladaptive, there's something wrong with it. There's something wrong with it because it's not sustainable. It leads to death and to extinction. And for some reason, we seem to be evolutionary prepared to ring bells when we think of extinction and death and so forth. Except, of course, for anti-natalists, people like David Benatar and so forth. Apart from some peculiar and particular philosophical positions and particular philosophers, apart from those, most people would say, okay, so if this is a recipe for extinction, there's something wrong with it. But still, philosophically speaking, we could say that just because something is maladaptive doesn't mean that it is morally flawed, that it is morally problematic. So in this case, if liberalism is maladaptive, that doesn't mean that liberalism is morally flawed. That is not my position. I do think that if something is maladaptive, we have good reasons to think that it is morally flawed. And how do I justify my position? Well, my position in metaethics is moral naturalism, and by moral naturalism I mean a type of moral realism which is naturalistic, obviously, that says that nature. So this goes back to Aristotle, obviously, that we can find standards of morality in the regularities of nature. Some would call it natural law, some would call it rules of nature, whatever. But nature, but the idea here is that morality is not a product of our minds. So we are not Kantians. Morality is a product of nature. It is beyond ourselves. The best we can do is to grasp it, is to study nature in order to grasp those regularities. And that is humbling to a degree, because morality we are not producing morality. We are, at best, we are recognizing it and dealing with it in a proper way or not. And that is what I think is cultural selection done properly. It is to recognize the laws of nature in the way nature works, and to be able to recognize where good actions are and where bad actions are. And I think that at the more fundamental level, this natural law, or evolutionary natural law, you may call it, at the most fundamental level, we are forced, or we forced in this duty-based sense to deal with fitness. So to as Nietzsche would say, to affirm life, to embrace life, to embrace the standards of nature that we have around us, rather than fighting them because we have a different view of what we should do. I don't think we are so important. I do think that we should recognize the regularities of nature, just like Aristotle would tell us. So yes, and I have my way of understanding this is from a moral functionalist perspective, where I do think that everything in nature will have a certain function, and evolutionary biology, despite all that is said about functions, still very much deals with functions. The heart has this function, the legs have that function, wings, etc., etc. I think that it is relatively easy to understand functions in nature, and if you are a moral functionalist, it's simple to go from is to ought. It is not so different. You have a problem when you are not a moral naturalist. Then you have a problem. Then you think that the is always separated from the ought, or at least as a basis. But that is not my case. I do think that is not problematic at all.
So, I mean, if your thesis about the evolutionary limits of liberalism is correct, and if people accept the meta-ethical stance you've just described, then in that case, would liberalism be morally flawed or even immoral?
Yes. Yes. Of course, we have to be careful about saying this because we can say yes in a very general sense. It doesn't mean that everything we do within liberalism is immoral. So we have to separate these. So the answer, I said yes, but the answer is much more nuanced, obviously. So what we could say is that everything about liberalism that leads to maladaptive behaviors uh, is morally flawed. So let's put it like this, because it sounds it sounds a more sophisticated. But yeah, in a nutshell, liberalism has many flawed dimensions at the moral level. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the book is again The Evolutionary Limits of Liberalism, Democratic Problems, Market Solutions, and the Ethics of Preference Satisfaction. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview and also a link to our first talk. So, Dr. Nobre Faria, just before we go apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. You can just uh, Google my name, and you will find me at IFILNOVA, which is my research center and my university. And over there, I have my publications. It is still being updated, but most of my publications are there. So yes, that's the best place to find. That's the best place to find my work.
Okay, great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on to come on the show. As I said at the beginning, the book is a great read, so I hope everyone runs and buys it when the interview is out. And it's always a pleasure to everyone.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalania, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Haslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deja Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Antonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yagi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sunny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luis Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.